Thank you, Senator. Representative Mulvaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try real hard to do something that politicians are not really good at, which is not ask a stupid question. It's been a lot longer since I studied economics, and it has been for most of you, and my mind is clouded by law school and business school on top of that, so I'm going to try and keep it real simple for my own purposes. Let's talk about dynamic scoring for a second, because it strikes me that while y'all seem to disagree on some of the outcomes, aren't we having a dynamic discussion in terms of using a dynamic model to discuss the impacts of tax changes? And if that's the case, even though you seem to disagree on the outputs, Dr. Hassett would suggest that the impact of a tax reduction would be significant. Dr. Gravel, you'd say it's not, but those are both dynamic statements, aren't they? And shouldn't we be looking for some place that we can agree on, that we need to move away from this zero impact model that the CRS currently has towards something that perhaps allows for a range of outcomes that reflects perhaps a scope or a scale of possible outcomes that are reflected by you folks here today? Why aren't we having that discussion? I'll start with you, Dr. Gravel, since you're CRS. Why does CRS oppose dynamic scoring?
No. And my model has results. I mean, it has effects. It's just the effects are small, as is the provision you're changing.
Sure.
They're both small, so you wouldn't expect
But that would be
effects.
different than the static model we're required by law to use now.
But the Joint Tax Committee uses a model that has micro responses. They have, for example, very, very large capital gains realization response, which is probably why they haven't scored the Buffett rule as, you know, the Buffett tax as being very high. They have a rule that they keep output labor and capital inputs, total GDP constant. But they have done studies in the past, and so has CBO. But the problem with those studies is they just depend on what you're doing about the deficit. I mean, they have the same kinds of results that I do. You know, if you look at a tax cut in isolation, like the corporate tax, you're likely to find an increase. You may argue about whether it should be 0.5% or 0.2%, or the size of the revenue or whatever, but they have those. But then if you don't pay for it, if you run the deficit, then you do crowding out of capital, which can end up worse. So both CBO and JCT have done studies, and the problem is they aren't, you know, the assumptions are what matter as far as the magnitude. So I think they've probably decided it's safest not just to keep that constant.
And I think I would probably tend to agree with that, that it's, you say it's safest, it sounds to me like you could spin it a different way and say it's just too hard to do it another way.
Maybe too hard, maybe not ready for prime time. I mean, I don't know.
But I share the same frustration that Dr. Hassett has, which is that the net result is that we use a model that doesn't seem to tie to reality. You can go back and look at the tax reductions of the 80s and see that this clearly was not a zero impact. You can look at tax increases in the 90s and make the same determination. So I guess what is CRS's position on moving away from a static model into dynamic?
Well, I think my position would be, I think I want to do whatever will lead you to the truth the best. The problem is the truth is elusive. It depends on what assumptions you're making.
Does the static model give us the truth?
I don't think so. No, how could it? It would be a point observation that you would never expect to find. But the question is it better for policy making when you have differences depending on the various assumptions you make, not only about deficit financing, but by short-run monetary policy, about the size of elasticities. There's no consensus about a lot of that.
Dr. Hassett, I tend to agree with Dr. Gravel in that sense, that once you start moving to a static model, away from a static model to dynamic, the debate will simply switch from whether or not we should have static versus dynamic to a discussion over what sorts of multipliers we're going to use. And we'll have the same lack of consensus that we have now. Is it possible, do you think, to develop a system that would allow us to use a dynamic system that would provide for, say, a possible range of outcomes that would at least give us a better look into the future as to what the impact of tax changes would be?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, Bill Thomas assembled a blue ribbon panel to discuss dynamic scoring, which I served on a long time ago. Yeah, that's right. And they introduced a couple. John Diamond, who's down at Rice, helped develop a model for the joint tax to do dynamic scoring. The CBO has worked on it. I think that the capability is now I like to say in Washington, all proof proceeds by induction. Something's true today because it was true yesterday. And so actually these models have been around long enough that they're true by induction. And so maybe that we could start to use them, because right now focusing all of our budget rules and everything on the zero effect, which everyone knows is false, seems incorrect to me. And the argument in favor of it has always been, well, if we allow dynamic scoring, then we'll lose fiscal discipline and the deficit will get too high. Well, the existing system hasn't really done a good job of enforcing fiscal discipline, and so I think that we should look for more reasonable ways to score.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.